Chapter 1. The Weight of Silver. The silver in my blood burned like liquid fire, a constant, sickening reminder that I was dying. I sat in the darkest corner of the rusty spur, my hood pulled low to mask the unnatural golden hue of my eyes. This bar was a cesspool of human misery, and it was perfect for a ghost like me. My loyalist, Silas, the only one left I could trust, was supposed to arrive minutes ago. Because he was late, my suspicion clawed at my gut. I kept my hand hovering near the dagger concealed beneath my jacket. Every breath I took was a battle against the poison. Still, I maintained my composure. I was the Alpha King, even if I was currently in exile, a broken monarch hiding in the shadows of a backwater tavern. I scanned the room with a predator's focus, my senses stretched thin, looking for the telltale signs of a Vane scout. After that, the door creaked open. My pulse quickened, not from fear, but from the instinctive readiness to kill. It was just a drunk stumbling in, a pathetic human wasting his life away. I exhaled, the sharp scent of stale beer and rain filling my nostrils. To make things worse, the toxin flared, sending a fresh wave of agony through my veins. My jaw tightened. I was a mountain of iron, crumbling from the inside. Before I could move to leave, a girl shoved through the crowd. She was vibrant, loud, and entirely out of place in this wretched hole. She laughed at something a friend said, her voice cutting through the thick smoke like a bell. I ignored her. She was a variable, a distraction I did not need. But then she stumbled, her hand catching the back of my chair to steady herself. She smelled of rain and vanilla. It was too sweet. Soon after, she turned to face me, her eyes bright with liquid courage and cheap gin. "Lost, handsome?" she teased. I didn't answer. I just stared, my cold gaze meant to send her running. But she didn't run. Instead, she leaned closer. Because she was drunk, she didn't see the warning in my eyes. She didn't see the monster sitting in the chair. In that moment, her audacity was almost impressive. She leaned over, her lips brushing the sensitive skin of my neck, right where my scent gland lay dormant. The world shattered. Chapter 2. The bond ignites. In the span of a breath, the scent bond ripped through my defenses like a lightning strike. My head snapped back. I couldn't breathe. My wolf, dormant and starved for years, roared to the surface with a hunger that terrified me. The mark burned. It was hot, electric, and utterly permanent. I grabbed her wrist, my grip tighter than I intended. She gasped, the alcohol instantly draining from her face as she looked into my eyes. "What?" she whispered. But then, the tavern door exploded inward. Without warning, the air shifted, turning thick with the musk of my pack's worst enemies, Vane's scouts. They had followed me. I let go of the girl, standing up with a grace that betrayed my weakened state. As I stepped forward, my wolves, the 3 loyalists waiting outside, burst into the room. They didn't see the scouts. They saw me. They saw the mark on the girl's skin. They dropped to their knees, their heads bowed to the floor. "Alpha King," they rumbled in unison. The silence in the room was absolute. Even the drunk at the counter stopped moving. The scouts froze, their weapons hovering, their eyes wide with disbelief. My cover was gone. My life, my solitude, and my carefully constructed exile were blown wide open because of a girl's drunken dare. I turned to her. She looked at me, her eyes wide, realizing exactly what kind of monster she had just kissed. Because of that, I had no choice. I lunged toward her, wrapping my arm around her waist to pull her back from the center of the room. She was trembling. She was my anchor now, whether I wanted it or not. The bond pulsed, a physical ache in my chest that tied her heartbeat to mine. I growled, a low, rumbling warning that sent the scouts scrambling backward. What followed was chaos. I pushed the girl toward the back exit. "Run," I commanded. She didn't move. She stood there, frozen by the sight of the wolves, her eyes glued to my face. I grabbed her hand. A mistake, for the heat of her touch nearly sent me to my knees. Her skin against mine felt like a bridge to a world I wasn't allowed to inhabit. I felt her fear. I felt her curiosity. It was too much. Moments later, the first scout attacked. I shifted, not fully, but enough. My nails sharpened into claws, my senses sharpening until I could hear the scout's heart stutter. I met him in midair. One strike. His neck snapped. I didn't care about the brutality. I only cared about the girl. I shoved her toward the door again. "Go!" I roared, the sound of my voice vibrating with enough power to shatter the glasses on the bar. She didn't know what scared her more, the men with the silver blades or the man standing in front of her, dripping with blood and radiating a king's fury. She turned and bolted. I followed. The forest swallowed us whole, but I could feel the pull of the bond, a thin, glowing string that told me exactly where she was. I wasn't just chasing a human. I was chasing my own undoing. Chapter 3. The Forest of Secrets. The forest floor was a mess of rotting leaves and slick mud, but I didn't slow down. Because of the silver poison in my veins, every step felt like driving a hot blade into my own thigh. The girl, Elara, was panting hard ahead of me, her boots slipping on the damp terrain. She didn't know the woods. She didn't know that the shadows here were alive with Vane's trackers. Still, I pushed her forward. My senses were screaming. I could smell the metallic tang of Vane's hounds closing in, their pack mentality fueled by the scent of a human. To make things worse, the bond pulsed again. It was a rhythmic thrum, echoing the beat of Elara's racing heart, and it made my own chest ache with a bizarre suffocating possessiveness. I wasn't just protecting a liability. I was tethered to a living, breathing map of my own vulnerability. "Stop!" Elara gasped, stumbling over a tangled root. She collapsed, her breath coming in ragged, shallow gulps. I didn't stop. I reached down, grabbing her arm with enough force to make her wince, and hauled her back to her feet. "If you stop," I growled, my voice a rasping, primal sound that barely sounded human, "you die." Before she could argue, a howl ripped through the canopy. It was close. Too close. Vane's men were fast, but they were arrogant. They thought the wounded king was easy prey. They were wrong. Even with the silver eating my insides, I was still the alpha. "Why are they hunting me?" she whispered, her eyes searching mine with a terrifying amount of trust. I didn't answer. Truth be told, I didn't want her to know. I didn't want her to understand that her very existence was now the biggest political target in the shifter world. I just shoved her toward the dense brush. "Keep moving," I commanded. As the wind shifted, I caught the scent of the scouts again. They were closer now. I needed to lead them away, but I couldn't leave her. That was the trap. Chapter 4. The Threshold of No Return. The night air grew colder as we reached the riverbed, the water rushing over the stones like 1,000 chattering voices. Elara was shivering, her clothes damp and torn, yet she didn't cry. She didn't beg. She looked at the raging current, then back at me, her jaw set in a line of defiance that shouldn't have belonged to a human. "I can't go any further," she said, her voice shaking but steady. "Tell me what's happening." I pinned her against the trunk of a massive cedar. The space between us burned, the bond acting like a physical weight, forcing me to lean into her. Her scent of vanilla and rain was maddeningly strong, drowning out the bitter smell of my own blood. I looked at her, at the soft pulse in her neck, at the defiance in her eyes, and for a second, I forgot about the throne. I forgot about the silver. "You're marked," I whispered, the words tasting like ash. "By me. And now you're property of the Alpha King. There is no going back to your life." She went pale, the reality of her situation finally dawning on her. "Then let me go," she challenged. As if pulled by a string, I pulled her closer. My forehead rested against hers. "I can't." Because the bond wouldn't let me. It was an ancient, unbreakable law. It demanded I keep her, protect her, and possess her. I hated it. I hated the weakness of needing someone else to keep the balance. But as her hand tentatively touched my chest, my wolf quieted. The pain of the silver receded, replaced by an overwhelming sense of clarity. Soon after, a twig snapped in the darkness. I whirled around, my claws extending as a scout burst through the undergrowth. I didn't give him a chance to speak. I moved, a blur of shadow and lethal intent, and ended him before he could draw his blade. I turned back to Elara. She was staring at the body, her face white as a sheet, but she wasn't screaming. "We go to the silent peak," I said, my voice heavy with the finality of a death sentence. "It's the only place left." She nodded, a single jerky movement. She didn't know what waited for her at the peak, but she followed me. We crossed the threshold into the wildlands, leaving the world of humans behind. I wasn't just a man anymore. I was a guardian, a king without a crown, and I was dragging a human girl into a war she couldn't possibly understand. But as we walked, her hand slipped into mine. Her bones remembered me. And despite the danger, I let it happen. Chapter 5. The Fortress of Shadows. The silent peak loomed above us like a jagged tooth tearing into the throat of the sky. It was a brutalist nightmare of black stone and narrow, winding paths, a tomb disguised as a fortress. As we ascended the final treacherous ridge, the cold wind whipped Elara's hair into a frenzy. She looked up at the towering ramparts, her architect's eyes scanning the structure with an intensity that felt like a violation. She wasn't just seeing a prison, she was reading the flaws in the design. "It's not just a home, is it?" she asked, her voice barely carrying over the gale. I didn't answer. I led her through the iron-bound gates, the metal groaning in protest as they swung open. The interior was a cavernous expanse of cold, gray stone. Torches flared to life as we entered, their flicking light casting monstrous shadows against the walls. My loyalists emerged from the dark, their eyes tracking Elara with a mix of awe and suspicion. They had never seen a human inside these walls. "She is under my protection," I growled, my voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling. Still, they bowed. I gestured toward the central chambers. My strength was failing, the silver toxin spreading further with every passing hour. I had to maintain the mask of the iron-willed king, but my knees felt like water. I turned to Elara, my gaze sharp. "Stay within the inner sanctum. Do not go near the walls." She opened her mouth to argue, but I was already turning away. I needed to hide my weakness, to keep the pack from seeing that their king was dying. Chapter 6. The Weight of the Crown. That night, the fever took me. I retreated to the deepest, most secluded wing of the fortress, collapsing onto a hard stone bench. The silver in my blood felt like molten lead, heavy and suffocating. My wolf was pacing beneath my skin, scratching at the bars of my ribcage, desperate to shift, desperate to heal. But to shift now would be to expose the full extent of my rot. Before I could lock the door, a soft tap echoed through the chamber. "Elara." I tried to stand, but my body failed me. I fell back, a low, guttural groan escaping my throat. The door pushed open, and there she stood, holding a flickering candle and a handful of bitter-smelling herbs. She didn't look like a captive. She looked like a woman who had decided to take control of her cage. "I heard you fall," she said, her voice steady. "Leave," I hissed, the command dying in my throat as another wave of agony hit. She ignored me. She knelt by my side, her touch surprisingly cool against my burning skin. As her fingers brushed my arm, the bond flared, a warm golden light that dimmed the cold fire of the silver. I gasped, my eyes flying open. She was doing something, pulling at the threads of the connection, using it to anchor me. "How are you doing that?" I whispered. "I don't know," she murmured, her brows furrowed in concentration. "It just feels like I'm tracing a line." As the silence stretched, the air in the room grew heavy with our proximity. I was vulnerable, truly, dangerously vulnerable, in a way I had never allowed another soul to see. The king was stripped bare, and the girl was the only witness. Chapter 7. The First Fracture. Moments later, the alarm bells rang. The sound shattered the intimacy of the room. I shoved Elara behind the stone pillar, my instincts overriding my exhaustion. We were under attack. Vane's raiders had bypassed the outer patrols. They were here. I stood, my legs shaking, and drew my blade. Elara didn't cower. She watched the doorway, her hands gripping a loose stone she'd pried from the masonry. "Stay down," I snarled. The door exploded. 2 warriors charged in, their blades coated in that wretched glowing silver. I met them with a roar, my sword singing through the air. I fought not with finesse, but with the raw, desperate power of a dying man. I took down the first, but the second caught me in the ribs, the silver burning deep. I crumpled, the world tilting sideways. As I hit the ground, the raider raised his blade to end it. Without thinking, Elara moved. She didn't have a weapon, but she had the environment. She shoved the heavy stone pillar's loose base, triggering a collapse in the ancient architecture she'd been studying. A section of the ceiling plummeted, crushing the raider beneath tons of rock. The dust settled. I looked up at her, breathing hard, my vision blurring at the edges. She was standing amidst the ruin, her face covered in gray soot, her eyes blazing with a fierce, terrifying intelligence. She hadn't just saved me. She had used the fortress as a weapon. I felt the bond pulse, a sharp, stinging throb of pride that I wanted to choke out. She was my salvation, and that was the most dangerous thing of all. Chapter 8. The Poisoned Well. The aftermath of the attack left the silent peak feeling smaller, the stone walls pressing in like a closing fist. I slumped against the cold masonry, my breath hitching as the silver toxin surged, turning my veins into rivers of agony. Silas, my only remaining commander, knelt before me, his face grim. The couriers I had dispatched for medicinal roots had not returned. In fact, they hadn't even made it past the valley floor. "Vane is tightening the noose, my king," Silas muttered, his voice barely a tremor in the stillness. My trust in my inner circle, what little was left, shattered. Every shadow felt like an informant. I turned my head, my vision swimming, to see Elara standing by the arched window watching the horizon. She was different now. The shock of the raid had worn off, replaced by a cold, calculating resolve that mirrored my own. She wasn't just a guest. She was becoming a fixture of this war. Still, I felt the phantom ache of the bond. It was a constant, irritating pull toward her, a reminder that I was no longer a lone wolf. I tried to dismiss the thought, but it persisted. To make things worse, the silence of the fortress felt heavy with impending doom. I had to get supplies or we wouldn't survive the week. I looked at the maps scattered across the table, a labyrinth of mountain passes I knew by heart. "We hunt tonight," I commanded, though the words were a struggle. Chapter 9. The Midpoint Shift. Before I could rise, my body rebelled. A sharp, searing pain tore through my center, and I collapsed. The mask, the iron-willed, invincible Alpha King, fell away. I hit the floor hard, my consciousness fracturing like glass. I was no longer in the throne room. I was falling, drifting into a delirium where the faces of my fallen pack members whispered from the dark. I felt their disappointment, their cold, judgmental gazes. "You led us to ruin," they hissed. "No," I choked out, clawing at the stone floor. Suddenly, hands were on me, cool, steady, and refusing to let go. Elara. She wasn't fleeing, she wasn't looking for a way out. She was stripping off my tunic, her fingers finding the wound where the silver blade had bitten deep. The bond flared, a sudden, blinding burst of gold that acted as a shield against the darkness. "Stay with me, Kaelin," she whispered, her voice a lifeline in the storm. As if pulled by a string, my spirit fought its way back. I opened my eyes, gasping, and saw her face, so close, so terrified, yet so fiercely determined. In that moment, the revelation hit me with the force of a landslide. If I died, the bond would snap and she would be defenseless. I wasn't just fighting for a crown anymore. I was fighting for the only person who refused to let me die. Chapter 10. The Price of Survival. Moments later, the heavy doors of the sanctum vibrated. A rhythmic booming sound echoed through the chamber, a broadcast amplified by Vane's dark sorcery. His voice filled the room, slick and cruel. He had captured my former second-in-command, the man who had supposedly been scouting the perimeter. Vane dragged him into the light on the projection, his blade pressed against the man's throat. "I know you're watching, Kalen." Vane's voice boomed, dripping with mockery. I struggled to my feet, leaning heavily on the stone table. My head spun, but my heart was a hammer against my ribs. Vane wanted my head, and he was using my own people to bait the trap. The goal had shifted. It wasn't about holding the silent peak or surviving the night. It was about tearing Vane apart before he could touch anyone else. "He's going to kill him," Elara said, her eyes tracking the broadcast. "He's going to kill us all," I corrected, my voice a growl of pure, unadulterated fury. The space between us burned with the tension of the moment. I looked at her, then back at the projected image of my dying ally. My life of solitude was a lie, a prison I'd built for myself. I saw it now. I couldn't win this war from the shadows, and I couldn't win it alone. As the shadow of the enemy grew, I reached out and took Elara's hand, feeling the spark of our connection hum against my skin. The game had changed. The stakes were no longer political. They were personal, and I would burn the entire world to ash before I let Vane take one more step toward her. Chapter 11. The Calculated Risk. The decision burned in my throat like bile. We couldn't wait for Vane to come to us. The silent peak was a fortress, but it was also a coffin if we remained stagnant. My head throbbed with the rhythm of the silver still pulsing in my veins, yet I stood straight, forcing the Alpha's mantle back onto my shoulders. Silas and the others gathered in the armory, their faces grim under the torchlight. I pointed to the map, a narrow gorge leading to Vane's forward base. "We strike at dawn," I rasped. Elara stood by the door, her eyes fixed on me. She didn't look like the panicked student from the bar anymore. She looked like a soldier. I walked over, my movements stiff, and caught her gaze. I wanted to command her to stay, to lock her in the deepest chamber where the stone was thickest, but the words died on my tongue. I knew she wouldn't listen. "I'm coming with you," she stated, her voice devoid of a question. "You're a target, Elara," I countered, my hands clenching at my sides. "Every step you take broadcasts our location through the bond." "Exactly," she replied, stepping into my space. "If they can track me, they'll come to me. We use that." As the silence stretched, I felt the truth of it sink into my marrow. She wasn't asking for permission. She was proposing a strategy. For the first time, I didn't treat her as a fragile human. I treated her as an equal. I nodded, a singular heavy movement that sealed our fate. We were committed to a path of fire, and there was no turning back now. Chapter 12. The Infiltration. By the time we reached the perimeter of Vane's base, the sky was bleeding a sickly pre-dawn gray. We moved through the undergrowth, my senses locked onto the enemies guarding the gates. The bond was a live wire between us, humming with an intensity that made the hair on my arm stand up. I could feel her anxiety, her adrenaline, and the underlying pulse of her desire to prove her worth. "Wait," I whispered, pulling her down into the mud behind a rotting log. I signaled to Silas. We took the guard silently, a blur of shadow and steel. The success was intoxicating, a brief rush of old power returning to my limbs. But as we breached the inner courtyard, the bond surged. It wasn't just a physical connection anymore, it was an emotional one. I felt her terror at the sight of the cages, her empathy for the trapped wolves, and it crashed into my own icy resolve, making it difficult to maintain my focus. "Kalen," she gasped, her hand clutching my arm as she saw the state of the prisoners. The sight was enough to shatter anyone's composure. I felt her pain, as if it were my own, It was maddening, a distraction that forced me to split my attention between the kill and her heart. Still, I pushed forward, clearing the path with a brutal, calculated efficiency. We were winning, yet the air felt thin, charged with the static of an impending storm. Chapter 13. The Unbroken Thread. Moments later, the base erupted in chaos. Vane had anticipated us. He had been waiting for the scent bond to lead us straight into his trap. Horns blared from the watchtowers, and the ground began to tremble under the weight of an approaching pack. I spun around, grabbing Elara by the shoulders, my eyes searching hers. The realization hit me with the weight of a falling mountain. I had allowed myself to care. I had allowed this woman to become my compass, my anchor, and my reason for breathing. "We have to go," I snarled, pushing her toward the exit. She resisted, her heels digging into the dirt. Not without the others. "They're gone," I yelled, the sound tearing from my throat. I didn't care about the throne anymore. I didn't care about the territory or the politics of the old bloodlines. All that mattered was the warm, rhythmic thumping of her heart against my palm. I saw a blade glinting in the dark, a trap closing around us, and I didn't hesitate. I shoved her aside, taking the hit meant for her in the side of my chest. The silver burned, but it didn't matter. The only thing that mattered was that she was breathing. The bond screamed in protest, a violent golden flash that threw the attackers back, but we were cornered. We were broken, exposed, and trapped in the heart of the enemy's den. And yet, for the first time in my life, I felt truly, terrifyingly alive. Chapter 14. The Bitter Taste of Steel. The silver blade in my side was a cold, parasitic thing that sucked the life from my limbs with every heartbeat. I hit the dirt hard, the world spinning into a kaleidoscope of mud, blood, and mocking laughter. Vane emerged from the shadows, his boots crunching on the gravel with deliberate, agonizing slowness. Behind him, his guards dragged Elara forward, her arms pinned behind her back, her face streaked with dirt and defiance. The sight of her in his grip acted like a venom more potent than any silver. "The Alpha King, fallen in the mud like a common stray," Vane sneered, his voice smooth as oil. He didn't just want me dead, he wanted me to watch. I tried to crawl toward her, my muscles screaming in protest, but a heavy boot slammed into my chest, pinning me to the earth. I coughed, the metallic taste of blood filling my mouth. I watched as Vane reached out, gripping Elara's chin with a gloved hand. She spat in his face. A second later, the butt of a rifle slammed into her stomach and she crumpled, a choked sound of pain escaping her lips. That sound, that small broken sound, shattered the last of my restraint. Chapter 15. The Silence of the Grave. The world went white. I didn't hear Vane's threats anymore. I didn't hear the wolves howling in the distance or the frantic beat of my own dying heart. I was drowning in a sea of my own failure. My loyalists lay scattered in the courtyard, their bodies still, their fight finished. I had been too proud to ask for help, too isolated to build real alliances, and now, my arrogance had cost the only person who had ever truly seen the man beneath the crown. Soon after, they dragged me toward the center of the yard, throwing me into a kneeling position beside her. Elara looked up at me, her eyes clouded with pain, yet she managed a weak, trembling smile. It was a knife to the gut. She was dying because of me. The bond, once a lifeline, now felt like a noose, tightened by the knowledge that I couldn't save her. Vane stepped back, drawing his sword, the blade glowing with a sickly, iridescent light. "Look at her, Kaelin," he whispered. "See your legacy vanish in a pool of blood." I closed my eyes. I didn't want to see it. I didn't want to see the light go out of her eyes. I had spent my life seeking control, building walls to keep the world at bay, and in the end, those very walls had become my prison. I was nothing. I was a king of dust and ghosts, holding a broken hand in the dark. Chapter 16. The Dark Night of the Soul. The night deepened, the forest surrounding us growing unnaturally quiet as if it were holding its breath, waiting for the final act. Vane left us alone in the center of the courtyard, surrounded by his laughing pack, waiting for the moon to reach its zenith so he could perform his execution. The silence between us was heavy, a suffocating blanket of despair. I reached out, my fingers trembling as I brushed her cheek. "I'm sorry," I whispered, the words heavy with the weight of 1,000 regrets. Elara leaned into my touch, her breath shallow. "Don't," she breathed. "You're still the king, Kaelin, even here, especially here." "I am a failure," I countered, the bitterness rising in my throat. I thought strength was independence. I thought if I didn't need anyone, no one could hurt me. I was wrong. I was so wrong. As the silence stretched, I looked up at the moon. It was a cold, indifferent eye in the sky. My wolf was silent, its spirit crushed by the proximity of the silver, its fire extinguished. I felt a hollow, aching void where my power used to be, a cavernous emptiness that told me the end was near. I had lost the crown, the pack, and the only soul that had ever managed to breach the fortress of my heart. And as the guards began to move in, I finally understood the truth. I had spent my life preparing to die as a king, only to realize I had never learned how to live as a man. Honor, Chapter 17. The echo of a heartbeat. I knelt in the dirt, the cold silver soaking into my clothes, but then a flicker of warmth brushed my skin. Elara's hand found mine, weak and trembling, yet it held on with a tenacity that defied the darkness. Beneath the moonlight, our fingers interlaced, and I felt it. The bond, thin and fraying but still humming against my pulse. It wasn't a chain. It was a bridge. In that quiet, bleak ending, her touch sparked a memory. Not of a throne, but of her hands fixing the fortress, of her steady voice when I was delirious. Truth be told, I hadn't been fighting for the pack. I had been fighting to remain a monument of stone. As the realization washed over me, the hollow void in my chest didn't just ache, it filled. I realized that my territorial command hadn't failed because I was weak. It had failed because I was trying to force the world to bow rather than inviting it to stand beside me. The power wasn't in the crown. The power was in the connection. "Kaelin," she whispered, her voice barely a breath. "Look." Before I could move, a low, rhythmic thrum began to vibrate through the earth. It wasn't the sound of Vane's guards. It was the synchronized footfalls of the remnants, the few loyalists who had survived the slaughter, emerging from the dark woods. They weren't coming for the crown. They were coming for their alpha. Chapter 18. The Architecture of War. That night the shadows shifted. I stood, the pain in my side sharpening, yet I didn't lean on the blade. I looked at the scattered loyalists and the fortress walls looming above us. I saw the weakness in the foundation, the way the light hit the gorge, the exact angle where the wind funneled into the courtyard. I saw it all with a clarity that had been missing for years. I wasn't just a king, I was a builder, and I was going to use this terrain to tear Vane's ambition to pieces. "Listen to me," I growled, my voice regaining its iron resonance. The loyalists froze, their eyes locking onto mine. I wasn't ordering them to die for a throne. I was detailing a path to survival. I mapped out the gorge, the trap points, the way the ancient structure could be used to funnel the enemy into a narrow kill zone. I saw the flicker of hope in their eyes, a spark that hadn't been there when I was just a distant, cold ruler. Still, the danger loomed. We were outnumbered and battered. Yet, as I looked at Elara, who was forcing herself to sit up, I felt a resolve that was stronger than any army. I wasn't fighting for territory anymore. I was fighting for the woman who had reminded me that a leader is only as strong as the people he protects. We were no longer a broken pack. We were a storm, gathering force in the silence of the forest. Chapter 19. The Final Approach. Moments later, the air thickened with the scent of pine and impending violence. We moved in total darkness, a ghost pack slipping through the cracks of the world. I felt the bond pulling me toward Elara, who moved with a silent, desperate grace behind me. The urgency was visceral. I could taste the metallic tang of Vane's arrogance on the wind. Every step I took toward the courtyard felt like stripping away the years of armor I had built around my soul. I stopped at the edge of the gorge, looking back at the loyalists. "When we go in," I said, my gaze sweeping over their faces, "we don't take back the throne. We take back our lives." As if summoned, the wind roared, masking the sound of our movement. The tension mounted, a high-pitched hum of adrenaline that threatened to shatter my remaining composure. I touched the mark on my neck, the place where her kiss had changed everything. I was ready. I wasn't a king of stone anymore, standing above them. I was the alpha, standing with them. And as we stepped out of the shadows, I knew that whatever happened next, I would never be alone again. Chapter 20. The Shattered Throne. The throne room was a cavern of echoes, but Vane wasn't waiting on a seat of gold. He stood in the center, his sword leveled at Elara's throat, his face twisted in a mask of manic triumph. I stepped into the light, the weight of the silver in my side a dull, forgotten ache. I didn't reach for my weapon. I reached for the air, for the connection, for the pack. My loyalists surged from the shadows, a wave of fur and fury that tore through Vane's elite guard. "You're a dead man, Kalen!" Vane screamed, his eyes wide with a frantic, desperate hate. I ignored him. My focus was entirely on Elara. "Choose!" Vane roared, pressing the blade deeper until a bead of crimson blossomed on her neck. "The throne, or the girl. Rule the dust of this kingdom, or die with your human mate." I looked at the ancient, towering throne behind him, the symbol of everything I had sacrificed my humanity to protect. Then I looked at Elara. Her eyes were calm, trusting, and for the first time, I saw the truth. The crown was just metal. She was the future. I didn't choose the throne. I released it. "Take it," I growled, my voice echoing like thunder. As I dropped my sword, the bond ignited, a golden sunburst of raw, primal energy that shattered the silence of the room. I didn't need a crown to rule. I let the wolf out. The transformation wasn't a painful shift. It was an explosion. Fur, muscle, and absolute, terrifying speed. I lunged, not as a king, but as an alpha. I hit Vane with the force of a falling star, the impact vibrating through the stone floor, until the throne itself cracked and crumbled into ruin. Chapter 21. The Aftermath of Silence. The dust settled slow and heavy, turning the light into golden shafts. Vane was nothing but a memory, broken and forgotten in the rubble of his own ambition. I shifted back, gasping for air, my body raw and bleeding, but my heart was steady. I was wounded, yes, but for the first time in a decade I wasn't alone. I turned, my breath hitching, and saw the loyalists standing in the threshold. They weren't kneeling. They were standing, their heads held high, watching me with respect, not fear. Elara was there, rushing through the debris, her hands reaching for me. "Kalen," she cried, her voice cracking. She collapsed into my arms, her warmth soaking into my chest. I buried my face in her hair, savoring the smell of rain and vanilla, the smell of life. My loyalists retreated, giving us the space we had earned in blood and fire. The battlefield was still, the terror of the war replaced by the quiet, soft reality of survival. "It's over," I whispered, pressing my forehead against hers. "You're still the king," she murmured, her hand tracing the scar on my brow. "No," I countered, looking at the ruin of the throne room. "I'm just a man who finally knows what he's worth." Chapter 22. The New Horizon. That night, the sky above the silent peak was a tapestry of stars. The fortress was quiet, the air no longer thick with the metallic taste of silver and lies. We stood on the balcony, watching the world stretch out below, a vast, untamed landscape that was finally ours to protect. I wasn't a distant, cold ruler anymore, standing on a pedestal of ice. I was the alpha, standing with my pack, with the woman who had brought me back to the world of the living. I took her hand, our fingers interlaced, the bond a gentle hum beneath the skin. The void I had spent my life trying to fill with power was gone, replaced by the solid, grounding presence of her love. We were a new foundation, a new beginning. I looked at the horizon, the first light of dawn beginning to bleed into the dark, and I realized that true strength wasn't about standing above everyone else. It was about finding the one person who made it safe to stand with them. Epilogue. The sunset. The sun began to dip behind the mountains, painting the world in shades of fire and blood. I sat on the remnants of the stone wall, watching Elara laugh at something one of the pack members said below. The throne was gone, buried under the weight of the past, but the pack was strong. I held out my hand, and the light caught the mark on my skin, the symbol of the life I had almost thrown away. I finally understood. I wasn't a king of stone. I was a man who had survived the dark to find the light. And as Elara looked up and met my gaze, the wind carried a promise that felt like home. The war was over, the throne was dust. But we were here. We were together. And for the first time, that was more than enough. The end